Imagine you are standing at the edge of a hole in the ground. Not a small hole, not the kind of hole you trip over in your backyard. This hole breathes. You can feel it. Cold air pushes against your face like something underground is exhaling, slow and steady, like it's been breathing for 10,000 years and it's going to keep breathing long after you turn around and go home. The trees around you are completely still. No wind up here, but the air coming from that hole, it moves your hair. It smells like wet stone and old darkness, and something you don't have a word for, something that hasn't touched sunlight in so long it has forgotten what sunlight feels like. You are in Kentucky. You are standing above the longest known cave system on the face of the entire earth. And somewhere down there, deeper than any church, deeper than any grave, deeper than almost anything human beings have ever dared to go, there is a man. He has been down there for 6 days. He has a notebook, a compass, a hand-drawn map stretched across dozens of pages, and a headlamp that keeps flickering. He is not scared. That's what makes him different from everyone else. His name is Roger Brucker, and before he is done with his life, he will spend more time in the dark underground than almost any human being who has ever lived. He will crawl through passages so tight that he has to exhale every last bit of air from his lungs just to squeeze through. He will swim through underground rivers with his flashlight held above his head, not knowing if the ceiling will drop and trap him forever. He will map rooms so enormous that the beam of his light cannot reach the other side. And at the end, when he finally comes back up, when he steps back into the Kentucky sunlight with mud caked into every crease of his body, he will say something that nobody quite knows how to explain. He will say that some of the rooms down there were still lit. Not by his flashlight, not by any lamp he brought. Lit by something else. This is his story, but it is also the story of the cave. And the cave, as you are about to find out, has a story of its own, one that started long before Roger Brucker was born, long before Kentucky was a state, long before human beings first looked at that breathing hole in the ground and decided they needed to know what was on the other side. Sit down, get comfortable, because we are going underground. Let's start with the cave itself, because you need to understand what this place actually is before any of the rest of this makes sense. Mammoth Cave. The name comes from its size, not from woolly mammoths, though woolly mammoths did roam the land above it thousands of years ago. The name comes from the old meaning of the word mammoth, which simply meant enormous, colossal, something so big that normal language doesn't quite do it justice. And that name is not an exaggeration. Mammoth Cave, as we know it today, has more than 400 miles of mapped passageways. 400 miles. That is more than any other cave system ever discovered on this planet. If you could somehow straighten out every single tunnel and corridor and room and crawl space and river passage and vertical shaft inside Mammoth Cave and lay them end to end in a straight line, you would have a path long enough to drive from Louisville, Kentucky, all the way to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and still have miles to spare. And here is the part that will keep you up at night. That 400 miles, that is just what we have found. Cavers and scientists who have spent their entire professional lives studying this system believe, genuinely believe, based on math and geology and everything they know, that the full extent of Mammoth Cave could be 500 miles, maybe 600, maybe more. There are passages down there that no human being has ever seen. There are rooms that have never had a single photon of light enter them, not in the entire history of the universe. They have been dark since before there were eyes to see with. They have been sitting there, patient and enormous, waiting. Now here is the part that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. Mammoth Cave is not a hole, it is not a tunnel. It is a system, a three-dimensional maze of passages stacked on top of each other, connected by vertical shafts and sloping corridors, running for miles in every direction beneath a stretch of central Kentucky called the Pennyroyal Plateau. The cave has multiple levels, like a building, except instead of being built upward, it was carved downward and sideways over millions of years by water. That's how caves like this are made. Water, specifically slightly acidic rainwater that seeps into the ground and finds the cracks in limestone. Limestone, the rock that underlies most of this part of Kentucky, is made of calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate dissolves in slightly acidic water. Very slowly, over millions and millions of years, the water widens those cracks, it carves pathways, it creates rooms. It sculpts ceilings and walls into shapes that look like waves frozen in stone. It builds cathedrals out of rock, then fills them with silence and dark. The limestone under Kentucky is thick, hundreds of feet thick in places, and it has been sitting there for more than 300 million years, from a time when this entire region was a shallow tropical sea, teeming with the kind of ancient marine life that would eventually die and compress into rock. The shells of billions of ancient sea creatures, pressed together over millions of years, became the stone that water would later carve into Mammoth Cave. So when you walk into Mammoth Cave, you are walking inside the remains of an ancient ocean floor. You are walking through the crushed and dissolved shells of creatures that lived when the first fish were just learning to drag themselves onto land. Let that sit with you for a moment. You are inside deep time. The first human beings to enter Mammoth Cave came long before any European ever set foot in North America. At least 3,000 years before Roger Brucker was born, Native Americans, most likely the people archaeologists call the woodland culture, were going into this cave. We know this not from stories or legends but from physical evidence, because caves, especially caves like Mammoth, preserve things with stunning accuracy. No moisture, no sunlight, constant cool temperature. The conditions underground are almost perfect for preservation. Archaeologists working in Mammoth Cave have found mummified human remains. They have found artifacts, tools, baskets woven from plant fibers, bundles of dried reeds used as torches, sandals made from plant material. They have found cane torches left propped against the walls, as if someone set them down and simply never came back to pick them up. They have found the remains of fires built far enough from the entrance that no natural light could have reached them. These ancient people were not just wandering in and out. They were going deep. They were exploring. Their torches have been found miles inside the cave, at points where a person without a steady supply of fire would be in complete, absolute, total darkness. The question that has puzzled archaeologists for decades is why? Why were these people going so deep into this cave? One answer is mining. Mammoth Cave contains deposits of a mineral called gypsum, calcium sulfate, that forms in delicate white crystals on the cave walls. Gypsum has been used for thousands of years for a variety of purposes, including medicine. Some researchers believe these ancient cave visitors were harvesting gypsum for trade or for healing rituals. Another answer is ceremony. Caves hold enormous spiritual significance in many cultures, and it is not hard to imagine why. A deep cave is a place unlike any other on Earth. It defies every human instinct. The darkness is not like nighttime. Nighttime has stars, has the dim glow of the moon, has the eye's ability to slowly adjust. Cave darkness is different. It is total. It is absolute. Without a light source, you cannot see your hand held directly in front of your face. For a culture that understood the world in spiritual terms, entering the belly of the earth and surviving, and returning, might have been an act of enormous power. But here is what we know for certain. These ancient people went in, they explored, they went so far in that they needed multiple torches, carefully managed, not to run out of light and die in the dark, and they came back out. And then, for reasons we don't fully understand, they stopped going in. And the cave sat empty for a long, long time. The European rediscovery of Mammoth Cave is wrapped in a legend that is probably not entirely true, but is so perfectly suited to the place that people keep telling it anyway. The legend says that a hunter named John Houchin was chasing a wounded bear through the Kentucky woods one day in 1797 when the bear led him to the mouth of the cave. The bear disappeared inside, and Houchin followed, and found himself in a vast underground space bigger than anything he had ever imagined. Whether or not John Houchin and his bear are real, what is definitely real is what came next. Almost immediately after Mammoth Cave's existence became known to the European settlers of Kentucky, people began to mine it. Not for gypsum this time. For saltpeter. Saltpeter potassium nitrate is a key ingredient in gunpowder, and in the early 1800s the United States had a gunpowder problem. The country was young. It was frequently in conflict with the British, who controlled much of the trade. When the War of 1812 broke out, the demand for saltpeter, and therefore gunpowder, became critical. Mammoth Cave was full of it. The dry, stable conditions underground had preserved enormous deposits of a nitrate-rich soil that could be processed into saltpeter with relative efficiency. Workers, including enslaved black people forced into this labor, rigged up a system of wooden pipes, pumps, and ox-powered machinery to carry water from an underground river and leach it through the nitrate-rich earth. The resulting liquid was then boiled down to produce the raw material for gunpowder. Think about that for a moment. In the darkness of Mammoth Cave, hundreds of feet underground, by the light of oil lamps and torches, enslaved men worked to produce the gunpowder that would be used to fight the War of 1812. They breathed the cave air and carried the heavy loads and maintained the pipes and ran the pumps, and most of their names were never recorded, and most of their stories were never told. Some of those wooden pipes are still in the cave today, more than 200 years old, preserved perfectly by the same stable underground conditions that preserved the ancient Native American torches. When you visit Mammoth Cave now and your guide points to wooden infrastructure sitting on the cave floor, what you are looking at is evidence of that labor, that brutal, unrecognized underground labor carried out in the deepest dark. After the War of 1812 ended, and the saltpeter operation became less profitable, the cave's owners realized they were sitting on something else of enormous value. A tourist attraction. Mammoth Cave became a tourist attraction at almost exactly the same historical moment when the very concept of a tourist attraction was being invented. This was the early 1800s. America was young and expanding and deeply interested in demonstrating that it had natural wonders to rival anything in Europe. Europeans had ancient ruins, old cathedrals, centuries of history. Americans had wilderness, and wilderness on a scale that took the breath away. Niagara Falls, the Hudson River, the Appalachian Mountains. And now this, a cave so enormous, so complex, so otherworldly, that people who saw it with their own eyes struggled to find words for it. The first professional guide of Mammoth Cave was a man named Stephen Bishop. And this is where the story takes a turn that matters. Stephen Bishop was enslaved. He was owned by a man named Franklin Gorin, who had purchased the cave in 1838. Gorin was a Kentucky lawyer who saw commercial potential in the cave's growing reputation as a natural wonder, and he brought Bishop to the cave as a guide. Bishop was, at the time, somewhere between 17 and 20 years old. The records are not precise about his birth year, as enslaved people's birth dates were frequently not documented. What is documented, what is unmistakable, is the extraordinary nature of what Stephen Bishop accomplished. In the first years after he began working at Mammoth Cave, Bishop did something that no one else had managed to do. He explored it, not the familiar, already trafficked sections near the entrance. He went deeper. He pushed into areas that previous guides had not dared to enter, through tight passages and over dangerous chasms and across underground rivers. In 1838, Bishop discovered what is now called the bottomless pit, a vertical shaft dropping into the cave's lower levels, which had served as a barrier that stopped all exploration dead. Previous guides had stood at the edge of the pit, looked down into nothing and turned around. Bishop did not turn around, he found a way across. He placed a wooden ladder and used it to descend, and then continued exploring on the other side, becoming the first person in recorded history to reach the lower levels of the cave. He found rivers down there. He found what he named Echo River, a flowing underground waterway populated by a species of fish that had no eyes, fish that had lived in complete darkness for so many generations that their eyes had simply ceased to develop, absorbed back into the body as evolutionary baggage that served no purpose in a world without light. Bishop pulled one of those fish out of the water and stared at it. He was the first person to ever see a Mammoth Cave eyeless fish. He named the features of the cave as he found them: Gorin's Dome, the Snowball Room, Purgatory. He had a poetic instinct for naming things, and many of the names he gave to features of the cave in the 1830s and 1840s are still the names those features carry today. He created the first accurate map of Mammoth Cave. Drawn from memory without modern instruments, the map Stephen Bishop produced in 1842 was so accurate and so comprehensive that it served as the primary reference map for visitors and explorers for decades. When later scientists compared it to precisely surveyed modern maps, they found it to be remarkably correct in its proportions and its overall picture of the cave's layout. He did all of this as an enslaved man. He guided hundreds of visitors through the cave by lamplight, explaining its geology, its history, its wonders, with a knowledge and eloquence that astonished educated visitors from Europe and America. He spoke multiple languages. He was described by visitors in terms of open admiration. One British geologist called him the most remarkable man he had ever met. Franklin Gorin sold the cave and Bishop along with it in 1839. Bishop remained enslaved until he was finally granted his freedom, though only after years of service that had made the cave famous and profitable, and only years before his death. He died in 1857, shortly after his manumission, before he was able to enjoy the free life he had earned by uncovering more of the cave than anyone in history. But his map endured, his names endured. His discoveries formed the foundation upon which every future explorer of Mammoth Cave would build, including Roger Brucker. Now let's skip forward 100 years. Past the Civil War, past the early decades of the 20th century, past 2 world wars and a Great Depression, and the invention of the automobile and the airplane and the electric light. It is 1954. The United States is in the grip of a strange and particular kind of optimism, the post-war boom when everything seemed possible, when technology was going to solve every problem, when the future was something you could reach out and grab. And in the middle of all of this, a young man from Ohio named Roger Brucker is reading a magazine article about caves. Roger Brucker is in his 20s at this point, young, energetic, curious, and possessed of the particular kind of stubbornness that either gets people killed or gets them to places no one else has ever been. He is trained as a journalist and public relations professional. He is not a scientist. He is not a geologist. He is not, by any conventional definition, an expert in anything that has to do with caves. But he is absolutely, completely, obsessively fascinated by them. The article he reads is about a cave system called Flint Ridge, located a few miles east of Mammoth Cave in Edmonson County, Kentucky. Flint Ridge had its own complex of caves, several named caves, including Colossal Cave and Crystal Cave and Salt's Cave and Bedquilt Cave, and a small group of dedicated explorers had been pushing into its passages, mapping what they found and coming up with a wild theory that was beginning to seem less and less wild. The theory was this: Flint Ridge and Mammoth Cave were connected. Not just close to each other, actually connected underground. One continuous system running beneath the Kentucky landscape for miles, the two cave complexes joined somewhere in the deep dark by passages that no one had yet found. If it was true, it would be the longest cave system in the world. Nobody had proved it yet. Nobody had found the connection, but the evidence was circumstantial and compelling and growing. The layers of limestone matched. The underground streams seemed to flow from one direction toward the other. The maps of the two systems, when laid side by side, suggested passages that terminated at points facing each other across a gap that geology suggested should not really be there. Brucker gets in his car and drives to Kentucky. The group that Brucker falls in with is called the Cave Research Foundation, or CRF. It's a loosely organized collection of serious amateur cavers, and by serious, I mean people who think nothing of spending a weekend crawling through mud-filled tunnels on their hands and knees for 8 hours straight, eating sandwiches while sitting in underground rivers, sleeping on bare rock hundreds of feet below the surface. These are not casual hobbyists. These are people who have made the exploration of Mammoth Cave and the Flint Ridge system a central organizing purpose of their lives. They take detailed notes, they draw precise maps, they use surveying equipment to measure distances and angles, they catalog every passage, every room, every geological feature, and then they come back the next weekend and push a little further. Brucker takes to this world like he was made for it. He is physically capable, strong enough for the demanding work of moving through tight passages, flexible enough to squeeze through the kinds of gaps that experienced cavers call squeezes, where the rock presses against your chest and your back simultaneously, and you move by exhaling and pulling and praying that it opens up on the other side. And he can write, he can tell a story. He can explain what it feels like to be in a cave, not just the technical details but the experience of it, the disorientation, the cold, the way your lamplight creates a small bubble of visibility around you and beyond that bubble is absolute blackness in every direction, the way sound behaves differently underground, the way your own breathing sounds too loud, the way a dripping of water echoes differently depending on the size of the chamber. The way time becomes strange when you have no sky. Over the course of the late 1950s and through the 1960s, Brucker becomes one of the central figures in the effort to find the connection between Flint Ridge and Mammoth Cave. This effort is not glamorous. This is not the kind of adventuring that looks good in movies. There are no vast open chambers to stride through, no underground waterfalls illuminated by conveniently placed equipment. There are hours of crawling, there is mud. There is the particular misery of being underground for 12 or 15 hours at a stretch, cold and wet and aching, pushing through a tight passage that hasn't been explored before and not knowing if it goes anywhere or if it simply ends in solid rock 2 feet ahead of you. That's called a dig. When a passage closes down too tight to continue, but a caver believes it might open up again further in, they dig. With their hands, with small tools, moving rock and sediment and mud, bit by bit, hopping for a whisper of air movement that suggests open space on the other side. Air movement is the most precious thing in a cave explorer's world. In a completely sealed passage with no outlets, the air is still. No current, but when air moves, when you put your hand up and feel the faint, cool breath of a draft, it means the passage connects to something else. It means there is somewhere to go. And sometimes, far back in Flint Ridge, in passages no one had ever entered before, the cavers of the Cave Research Foundation would feel that draft, moving toward Mammoth Cave, carrying the faint mineral smell of deeper places. They were getting closer. Let me take a moment here and try to explain what it's actually like to be in this cave. Not the statistics, not the geology, but the physical, sensory experience of being hundreds of feet, underground in complete darkness with a headlamp as your only connection to visibility. You enter Mammoth Cave through the historic entrance, a vast, yawning opening in a hillside that exhales cold air even in summer. The temperature inside the cave hovers at a constant 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, not freezing but cold enough that you need layers, cold enough that if you're wet, which you will be in many parts of the cave, you need to be careful. Walking through the tourist sections of the cave, the wide, high-ceilinged passages that have been fitted with electric lights and smooth pathways for visitors, you get a hint of the scale. The ceiling in some chambers is 60, 70, even 90 feet above you. The walls are not smooth. They are sculpted by millions of years of water, carved into curves and undulations and overhangs, coated in places with the faint shimmer of minerals. But the tourist sections of Mammoth Cave are, in a very real sense, not really the cave. They are the cave's lobby, the cave's foyer. Beyond the lighted passages, beyond the maintained walkways, beyond where guides take their groups, is where the cave actually begins. To get there, you leave the path. You crawl. The passage drops to 3 feet in height, then 2 feet, then less. You are on your hands and knees in mud, or on your belly, pulling yourself forward with your elbows. The rock above you is sometimes close enough to scrape your helmet. The rock below you is wet. You move like this for 100 feet, for 200 feet, sometimes for much longer. Your world shrinks to the circle of light from your headlamp, the smell of damp stone, the sound of your own labored breathing, and the narrow channel of space in front of you that might lead somewhere and might not. Then the passage opens up. Suddenly, surprisingly, you push around a corner and your headlamp beam shoots out into space, real space, a chamber, a room. You stand up on shaking legs. You swing your light around. The room might be the size of a living room, or it might be the size of an airplane hangar. In the darkness, in that first moment when you're standing at the threshold, you genuinely cannot tell. Your light reaches 10, 20, 30 feet, and then it simply fails to illuminate anything beyond that. Whether the darkness beyond the reach of your lamp is a wall 2 feet away or empty space stretching for 200 feet, you cannot know until you walk toward it. And that experience, that standing at the edge of your light, looking into absolute dark, not knowing what is out there, never gets normal. No matter how many times you have done it, no matter how many years you have spent underground, you stand at the edge of your light and something in you goes very quiet. Because the cave doesn't care that you're there, that's the thing. The cave existed before you, it will exist after you. The dark beyond your lamp has been dark for millions of years, and your presence in it means nothing to the stone. You are a temporary visitor in a place that doesn't need visitors. Most people find this terrifying. Roger Brucker found it magnetic. By the early 1960s, the Cave Research Foundation had been pushing through Flint Ridge for years, and they had made extraordinary progress. They had mapped hundreds of passages in the system, passages that kept trending on the maps toward Mammoth Cave. The gap between the two systems was closing on paper, but closing on paper and closing in reality were two different things. The geological barrier between Flint Ridge and Mammoth Cave was a valley, the Houchins Valley, named in an echo of the old legend about the hunter and the bear. The valley cut across the landscape above, and below it, as far as anyone had been able to explore, the cave passages seemed to end. The valley, in geological terms, was where the protective cap rock that kept the caves dry and open had eroded away. Any cave passages that might have once run beneath the valley floor were thought to have collapsed, filled in, been destroyed by water erosion over millennia. The connection, if it existed, would have to go under the valley, under the river that ran through the valley, under all that vulnerable, collapsed limestone. Underwater. In an air-filled cave passage, even a very small one, you can eventually navigate. But if the connection between Flint Ridge and Mammoth Cave ran beneath the Echo River, if the only passage between the two systems was submerged, then things got significantly more dangerous. Cave diving, the art of going underwater in a cave. In 1960, the equipment for this was limited, the understanding of its dangers was incomplete, and the death toll among those who attempted it was sobering. Cave diving claimed lives with a regularity that made even hardened cavers uneasy. But if that's what the connection required, then that's what the connection required. In 1972, a group of CRF explorers, including Patricia Crowther, a programmer and mathematician who would later become famous in the history of computing for her work that inspired the first text adventure game, Colossal Cave Adventure, pushed through a notoriously difficult section of the Flint Ridge system called Hanson's Lost River Passage. Hanson's Lost River was a stream passage, ankle-deep, knee-deep in places, running through a ceiling so low that in many sections the explorers had to turn their heads sideways to keep their faces out of the water. The kind of passage where you move forward flat on your belly, the rock ceiling inches above your nose, cold water soaking every inch of you for what feels like forever. Patricia Crowther was one of the smallest members of the team, which was an advantage in the tight sections. She pushed through a squeeze that other team members could not fit through, and on the other side she found air, she found space, she found a continuation. The team followed. They pushed forward through the water-filled sections, through the tight crawls, through the passages that had never seen human light, and then they came to something they recognized. They came to a passage they had seen on a different map. A Mammoth Cave map. They were in Mammoth Cave. The connection had been found. After more than a decade and a half of work, after hundreds of trips and thousands of hours of crawling and mapping and pushing and digging, the Cave Research Foundation had done what geologists had theorized and cavers had dreamed of. Mammoth Cave and Flint Ridge were one cave. One continuous system. The longest cave in the world. Roger Brucker was not in the cave the day the connection was made, but he had been part of the effort for almost 2 decades at that point. His maps were part of the foundation. His years of survey work, his pushing of passages, his contribution to the slowly accumulating knowledge of the system, it was all part of what made that final push possible. When the news of the connection reached him, he cried. He later said it was one of the most profound moments of his life, because it wasn't just a geographical discovery. It wasn't just a new entry in the record books. It was the proof that something he had believed, that this cave was continuous, that it connected, that it was even bigger than anyone had officially acknowledged, was true. After years of being underground in the dark, following passages that sometimes went nowhere, believing in the existence of something he couldn't see, he was right. The cave was real in the way he had imagined it. And it was enormous. Now I have to tell you about the rooms. Because this is the part of Roger Brucker's story that people don't usually talk about. This is the part that doesn't fit neatly into a documentary about geological exploration. This is the part that, depending on how you look at it, is either a fascinating psychological phenomenon or something that raises questions that geology can't answer. Roger Brucker spent more than 50 years exploring Mammoth Cave. He wrote books about it, most famously The Longest Cave, co-authored with Richard Watson, which documented the search for the Flint Ridge connection. He gave lectures. He mapped. He mentored a younger generation of cavers. He was, by any measure, one of the most knowledgeable people on Earth about the underground world beneath Kentucky. And in his later years, in the interviews he gave, in the conversations he had with people who knew him well, he talked about something he had experienced in the cave that he never fully explained. He talked about light. Not the light from his headlamp, not the light from the lamps of other cavers. He talked about light that seemed to come from the cave itself, from the walls, from the spaces beyond his lamp's reach, a faint luminescence that he noticed in certain chambers and certain passages at certain moments. Now here is where you have to be careful, because there are several things this could be. Some cave minerals glow faintly when exposed to certain wavelengths of light. Some microbial life, bacteria and fungi that live in cave environments, can produce very faint bioluminescence. The human eye, under conditions of extreme darkness, can sometimes interpret random neural firing as light, a phenomenon called phosphene, which is the visual noise your visual cortex generates when it isn't receiving any actual visual input. Experienced cave explorers are familiar with this. It's why you sometimes see shapes and flickers in the dark, even with your eyes closed. And Roger Brucker was a rational man. He knew all of this. He knew the explanations. But he kept talking about the light. In interviews near the end of his life, he described entering certain chambers in the deep parts of Mammoth Cave, chambers he knew well, chambers he had mapped and surveyed, and finding them in what he called a different quality of darkness. Not bright, not illuminated in any normal sense, but not entirely dark either. A state that he said his instruments and his reason told him was impossible, but that his experience insisted was real. He called it the lit rooms. He said some rooms in the cave were lit. He talked about this in the way a man talks about something he knows sounds strange but will not deny, not with embarrassment, not with apology, with the quiet certainty of someone reporting what they actually saw. Other cavers, when asked, had similar stories. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough of them independently to suggest that this was not simply one man's imagination. Deep cave cavers, people who spend extended time in passages far from the entrance, in conditions of genuine darkness, sometimes report what is called deep cave awareness, a state of heightened perception that develops over long periods underground. The senses recalibrate. The sense of smell becomes sharper. The sense of hearing becomes sharper. And some cavers report that their vision, stripped of the overpowering input of surface light, begins to pick up things it normally cannot. Whether what Brucker saw was a real optical phenomenon, some property of certain caves that science hasn't yet fully characterized, or a result of decades of neurological adaptation to underground conditions, or something else entirely, no one can say for certain. What is certain is that Roger Brucker believed it was real, and Roger Brucker was not a man who said things he didn't believe. When he came out of the cave for what proved to be one of his final extended explorations, when he climbed out of that hole in the Kentucky hillside, for the last time with his maps and his notebooks and his headlamp, he stood in the sunlight and he talked about the rooms that were still lit. And he said, in words that people who were there still remember, that the cave was not as dark as everyone thought. Let me tell you something about what it means to map a cave. Because mapping sounds simple. Mapping sounds like something you do with a measuring tape and a notebook. And on one level, it is. A cave survey is methodical and technical. You set up survey stations, you measure the distance between them, you note the angle of each measurement in 3 dimensions, you sketch the walls and the ceiling and the floor to scale, you note the geological features and the height of the ceiling at each station and the width of the passage. This is what cave mappers do, this is the work. But here's the thing about that work when it is done in the deep parts of Mammoth Cave, in passages that have never been entered before. You are making the first record of a place's existence. Think about what that means. Every mountain on the surface of the Earth has been seen from the air, photographed by satellites, mapped to a precision of inches. Every inch of ocean floor has been at least partially scanned by sonar. There are very few places on the surface of the world that have never been mapped, never been documented, never had human eyes fall upon them. Underground is different. Underground, particularly in a system as complex as Mammoth Cave, there are places today, right now, as you are reading this, that no human being has ever seen. Passages that have never had a light shone into them. Rooms that have existed in perfect darkness and perfect silence since before there was a human civilization to want to enter them. When Roger Brucker crawled into a new passage, a passage that his survey work suggested was there, or that a draft of air led him to, or that simple dogged persistence in pushing the known limits of the map revealed, he was doing something that had never been done before in the entire history of human beings on this planet. He was seeing that passage for the first time. He was making the first mark on a map that did not exist until he made it. In an age when everything seemed to have already been found, when the poles had been reached, when mountains had been summited, when every major river had been followed to its source, there was a place in Kentucky where real exploration was still happening, where you could genuinely go somewhere no human being had ever gone. And Roger Brucker kept going there for 50 years. There is something in that which defies easy analysis. Why would a person, a rational, intelligent, professionally successful person, spend decades of his life crawling through mud in the dark? What is the pull? What is the draw? Brucker talked about it in his writing. He talked about the satisfaction of the work, the pleasure of contributing to the map, the camaraderie of the small group of people who shared this commitment. He talked about the beauty of the cave, the formations, the rivers, the enormous chambers. He talked about the geological narrative that the cave told, the evidence of deep time written in stone. But underneath all of that, something else, something he came back to again and again. He said the cave was honest. On the surface, he said, the world was full of complexity and noise and things that presented themselves as one thing while being another. In the cave, you were dealing with reality in its most direct form. The rock was rock. The passage was passable or it wasn't. The map was right or it was wrong. The air moved or it didn't. In the cave, said Roger Brucker, you could not fool yourself for very long. Let's go deeper into the cave for a moment. Let's go to the places that most visitors never see. Imagine you have been underground for 8 hours. You have left the tourist sections far behind. You have crawled through passages that your body barely fits through. You have waded through 2 underground streams, the water cold enough to make your feet ache. You have climbed a vertical shaft using a rope, your headlamp illuminating the ancient flowstone on the walls as you ascend. Now you are in a part of the cave that was only mapped in the last few decades. The passage you're in is large enough to walk upright barely. The ceiling is rough and irregular, with stalactites hanging in clusters like stone icicles. The floor is a mix of dry clay and loose rock. Your headlamp is your entire world. Everything beyond it is black. Black in a way that doesn't exist anywhere on the surface, not in a windowless room, not in a closed closet, not in the darkest night. This is the absence of all light, which is different from merely dim light in a way that is hard to describe until you've experienced it. It is a positive presence, the dark. It has weight. It has texture. You move forward. Your feet sound different in here. The acoustics of the passage change as it widens, and your footsteps suddenly echo faintly before being swallowed by silence. Then you come to a room. Not a passage, a room. You step out of the corridor and the beam of your headlamp suddenly doesn't hit a ceiling for 12 feet, for 20 feet, for 30 feet. It just travels up into dark space that you can't see the top of. The walls of your lamp beam widen and dissolve. You swing the light left. The wall is there, covered in formations, delicate white gypsum flowers, each one a crystalline structure that grew millimeter by millimeter over thousands of years. You swing right. Another wall farther away. You tilt the light down. The floor is enormous, a dry, flat expanse of cave earth stretching out ahead of you. You are in a room that is bigger than any building you have ever been in. You are in a room that existed in perfect darkness for millions of years before you walked into it. You are the first person who has ever stood in this exact spot. Nothing you have ever done in your life has prepared you for the specific feeling of this moment. Roger Brucker stood in moments like this hundreds of times, and he said that sometimes in certain rooms at certain moments the dark was different, not completely dark, alive in a way that is hard to put into language. He said that in those rooms the cave felt inhabited, not by anything he could see clearly, not by anything threatening, just present, as if the cave in its particular rooms had accumulated some quality over millions of years that was detectable but not explainable. He was not a mystical man, he was not given to dramatic statements. He was a journalist, a communicator, a man who chose his words carefully. When he said the rooms were still lit, he meant something specific by it, and that specific thing was real to him in a way that he never backed away from. There is a feature of Mammoth Cave called the frozen Niagara. It is a flowstone formation, an accumulation of calcite deposited by water over millions of years, that cascades down a wall of the cave like a frozen waterfall. The stone ripples and flows in shapes that mimic moving water with uncanny accuracy. In the light of torches, in the first era of cave tourism, visitors stood before it and wept. The frozen Niagara is in a section of the cave that has been open to tourists since the 1920s. Thousands of people see it every year. It is stunning, unambiguously, straightforwardly stunning, in the way that certain natural formations are stunning because they are simply too beautiful and too strange to exist without producing a strong emotional response. But here is what I want you to think about. The frozen Niagara formed in complete darkness. No one saw it form. The water dripped and deposited and built and cascaded and created those shapes over millions of years without any light touching it. It did not form for anyone to look at. It did not form to be beautiful. It simply is what happens when water deposits calcite in a certain shape over a very long time. And yet it is beautiful, objectively, undeniably beautiful. Why? This is a question that sounds philosophical but is actually pointing at something real. Why do human beings find cave formations beautiful? Why do we look at stone shaped by water and feel something? The stone didn't develop to be aesthetically pleasing to mammals. The process that created it is purely chemical and physical. It has no awareness of its own beauty. It wasn't designed, it wasn't arranged, it just happened. And yet, stand in front of the frozen Niagara with your headlamp or a torch, and you will feel something that you would feel standing in front of a great painting or in front of the ocean at sunrise. A kind of awe, a kind of recognition. As if the universe, through purely mechanical processes, stumbled into the territory of the beautiful, and here you are, a small creature with a lamp, standing inside the accidental gallery. Roger Brucker felt this often. He wrote about it. He said the cave kept teaching him things that the surface world had made him forget, about scale, about time, about the smallness of human experience set against the vast patience of geology. He said you couldn't spend real time in Mammoth Cave without being changed. And he said it in a way that made clear he thought the change was good. I want to tell you about a specific expedition, one that illustrates what this work was actually like, the combination of methodical technical effort and the occasional, sudden, stomach-dropping discovery. This was in the early 1970s, in the period around the connection discovery. Brucker and a small team were pushing a section of the Flint ridge system, called the Swinnerton Level, a set of passages at a specific geological depth that the team believed might contain passages heading toward Mammoth Cave. They had entered the cave at the colossal cave entrance early in the morning. By noon, they had reached the starting point for the day's survey, a point in the map where the known passages ended and unexplored territory began. They ate lunch sitting on the cave floor, their headlamps making a small circle of yellow light in the middle of absolute darkness. Then they started pushing. The passage they were entering had been found the previous trip, a low horizontal crack in the wall that one of the team members had squeezed into and found, continued for at least a short distance before he ran out of time and had to turn back. Today, they were going to push it as far as it went. Brucker led the way. He got down on his belly. The crack was maybe 14 inches high, not enough to get onto hands and knees, barely enough to get onto elbows. He pushed his pack ahead of him and followed it in, using his elbows and his toes for propulsion, his helmet scraping the ceiling. He moved forward, the crack continued. He could feel a faint movement of air, not strong, but there. Something was up ahead. He moved through the crack for 60 feet, which took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of inch-by-inch belly crawling, constantly scraping against rock above and below, breathing in the cold, damp smell of unexplored stone, keeping his light trained on the passage ahead. At the 60-foot mark, The crack widened, then it opened. Suddenly, dramatically, the way good cave passages do, he pushed out of the crack and stood up in a chamber. The chamber was large. He swept his light around it, walls 20 feet to either side, ceiling 8 feet above him, and leading from it on the far side, a walking passage, a corridor of cave going forward in the direction of Mammoth Cave with enough headroom to walk upright. He stood in that moment alone. His team was still working through the crack behind him, and he was the first human being to ever stand in that chamber. He had pushed into it through 60 feet of belly crawl, and here was the reward: a room, a walking passage going forward. He stood there and breathed. He took out his notebook and wrote down the time and a description of what he saw. He pulled out his compass and took a bearing. He noted the air movement, definite from ahead. And he said this in a book, in his own words, that in that moment, standing alone in that room that no one had ever seen, he felt the cave in a way he couldn't describe. Not peaceful, not threatening, something else. He said the room felt ready, as if it had been waiting for exactly this, for a person to come in with a light and look at it. As if the darkness of that room, all those millions of years of perfect dark, had been a kind of held breath. And with his arrival, the room exhaled. The history of Mammoth Cave runs through American history like an underground river runs through limestone. It touches everything. We have talked about the Native American explorers, the saltpeter miners, the enslaved guides, the early tourist era. But there are other moments, other intersections between this cave and the wider world that are worth stopping at. During the tuberculosis epidemic of the early 1800s, there was a genuine medical belief that the constant cool temperature and clean air of Mammoth Cave could cure the disease. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, was one of the leading killers of the era, and a doctor named John Croghan, who owned the cave beginning in 1839, built a hospital inside it. He constructed stone cottages in the cave's large entrance chamber and brought in tuberculosis patients to live in them. It was a disaster. The patients, confined underground in the cold and damp without sunlight, deteriorated quickly. Some died in the cave. The experiment was abandoned after less than a year. The ruins of those stone cottages are still in the cave. You can see them on certain tour, the remnants of that well-intentioned and completely wrong medical theory. Rough stone walls built inside one of the most remarkable natural spaces on Earth, serving as an unintended monument to the limits of early 19th century medicine. Croghan himself died of tuberculosis in 1849, the same disease he had hoped his cave could cure. There is something appropriate about this. Mammoth Cave has a way of humbling human ambition. It is too old, too vast, too completely indifferent to what human beings want from it for any single human project to fully contain it. The miners used part of it, the tourists used part of it, the doctors tried to use part of it, the mappers mapped part of it, and the cave, through all of this, remained mostly unexplored, mostly dark, mostly indifferent, going about its geological business of dripping and depositing and slowly dissolving and silently expanding beneath the Kentucky countryside. Let's talk about the people who went underground and didn't come back. Because caves kill people. Not often, in the context of the millions of visits made to Mammoth Cave, but with enough regularity and enough horror to demand acknowledgement. The primary killers in a cave like Mammoth are not what you might expect. Not cave monsters, not collapsing ceilings. The primary killers are cold and disorientation. Hypothermia is the big one. The cave is 54 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. That sounds survivable, and it is if you are moving, if your clothing is dry, if you are generating body heat. But if you stop moving, if your clothing gets wet, if you are injured and cannot continue, 54 degrees will kill you. It will do it slowly, through the gradual dropping of your core body temperature, through the confusion and drowsiness that accompany the early stages of hypothermia, through the treacherous and final sensation of warmth that comes just before the end. Disorientation is the other one. Mammoth Cave's passages branch and rebranch in 3 dimensions. Without careful attention to the route, without a map, without markers, it is possible to become completely lost in a system of 400 miles of passages and never find the way out. This is not a theoretical danger. People have died in Mammoth Cave from getting lost. They have wandered the passages in the dark as their lights failed in the cold, unable to find the route back to the surface. The Cave Research Foundation was fanatical about safety protocols for exactly this reason. Every expedition was documented. Every team had a planned return time, and if they didn't surface by that time plus a safety margin, rescue operations began. Every caver carried backup lighting and survival equipment. The maps that the CIF so painstakingly created were not just scientific records, they were safety infrastructure. Knowing the cave meant being able to find your way out. And finding your way out was the difference between adding another entry to the survey logs and adding another entry to the accident reports. Roger Brucker understood this viscerally. He had been in enough situations underground to know how quickly a manageable situation could become a dangerous one. He had been trapped by rising water in stream passages. He had gotten turned around in unfamiliar sections and spent anxious minutes reorienting himself. He had been in passages when his primary light failed and he had switched to backup in the dark. He never had a serious accident underground, which is a testament to both his competence and his respect for the cave's capacity to harm. He was bold in pushing new passages. He was never reckless. The distinction between bold and reckless in cave exploration is a matter of preparation and judgment. It is the difference between going into an unknown passage, having thought through all the ways it could go wrong and having contingencies, and going into an unknown passage because you feel like it, and the thrill overcomes caution. Roger Brucker's 50-plus years underground without a fatal or seriously injurious accident is not luck. It is the product of the kind of careful, studied boldness that is the hallmark of really great explorers. There is another name that has to be mentioned when you talk about the mapping of Mammoth Cave. A name that most people have never heard, but that is as important as any in the history of this cave. Floyd Collins. Floyd Collins was a cave explorer and property owner in Edmonson County, Kentucky, who in the 1920s discovered a cave on his property that he hoped to develop into a tourist attraction to rival Mammoth Cave. He called it Crystal Cave. He worked on it for years, opening passages, installing lights, trying to draw visitors away from the dominant attraction of the area. In January of 1925, Collins went exploring alone in a cave on a neighboring property, a cave he was trying to connect to his own to create a bigger attraction. He was squeezing through a tight passage when a rock shifted and trapped his leg. He was wedged in a passage that was only a few feet wide, underground, unable to free himself. He was found alive by rescuers the next day, but his position was too awkward, too confined for them to reach him directly. They passed him food and lights and blankets. They dug, they tried. For 2 weeks, Floyd Collins remained trapped underground in the cold and dark while increasingly frantic rescue efforts went on above him and in the cave around him. It became a national news story, the first major media event of its kind in American history. Before television, this was radio and newspapers, and the story of Floyd Collins captivated the entire country. Reporters camped outside the cave. A young correspondent named William Burke Miller, who managed to crawl in and interview Collins in the passage where he was trapped, won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage. Collins died in the cave on February 16, 1925, from exposure and starvation, 16 days after he was trapped. He was never freed. His body remained in the cave for months before it was recovered. And then, in one of the stranger postscripts to an already strange story, Collins was buried in a glass-topped coffin inside Crystal Cave, the cave he had discovered himself, where for years his body was displayed to paying visitors as a macabre attraction. His remains were eventually moved to a cemetery, and Crystal Cave was later incorporated into what is now Mammoth Cave National Park. But the story of Floyd Collins, the 2 weeks underground, the desperate rescue efforts, the national attention, cast a shadow over cave exploration that persisted for decades. It became the definitive story of what could go wrong underground. The image of a man wedged in a tight passage, unable to move, slowly dying while the world above tried and failed to reach him. That image is the nightmare that cave explorers carry with them. It is the cautionary tale that never fully goes away. When Roger Brucker squeezed through tight passages in Mammoth Cave, he knew about Floyd Collins. Every serious cave explorer in America knew about Floyd Collins. The name meant, this is real, this is dangerous, the cave does not negotiate. And still he went in. One of the most extraordinary things about Mammoth Cave is the life it supports. You would not expect a place of total darkness to be teeming with life, and compared to a forest or an ocean reef, it is not teeming, but it is not empty either. The cave has its own ecosystem, a complex web of organisms adapted over thousands of generations to life without light. At the base of this ecosystem are bacteria, microbes that derive energy not from photosynthesis. There is no light for photosynthesis, but from chemosynthesis, from chemical reactions with the minerals in the cave walls and water. These bacteria are the foundation of the food chain in the dark. Above them, feeding on organic material that washes in from the surface through the cave's connections to the outside, are various cave-adapted invertebrates. Cave crickets, which are a keystone species in the cave ecosystem, they go out at night and forage on the surface, and when they return to the cave they bring with them organic material in the form of their bodies and their droppings, which feed the cave's permanent residents. Cave spiders feed on cave crickets. Cave beetles and millipedes feed on the organic matter the crickets bring. And then there are the animals that have gone furthest in adapting to cave life. the ones that have spent so many generations in complete darkness that their bodies have changed at the genetic level to reflect their environment. The Mammoth Cave crayfish is white, not the dark color of surface crayfish, but pale, almost translucent, without the pigmentation that serves no purpose in a world without light. Its antennae are longer than those of its surface relatives, compensating for the absence of vision with enhanced sensory touch. The Mammoth Cave shrimp is similarly depigmented, similarly equipped with enhanced non-visual senses. And then there is the cave fish, the Kentucky blind cave fish, the one Stephen Bishop pulled out of the Echo River in 1838 and stared at. These fish are not merely blind in the sense of having poor eyesight, they are blind in the sense of having no eyes at all. Their eyes begin to develop in the embryo, as in all vertebrates, and then they stop. They are reabsorbed. The fish that emerges into the cave river has smooth, pale skin where its eyes would be, no vestigial structures, no covered-over sockets, just skin. This is evolution at work in one of its most unambiguous demonstrations. These fish had ancestors that had eyes. Those eyes became unnecessary in the cave environment. Over thousands of generations, the resources devoted to growing and maintaining eye structures were redirected elsewhere, to the fish's lateral line system, which detects vibrations in the water, to its chemoreceptors, which detect chemistry. Eyes that weren't needed became metabolically expensive luxuries, and nature stopped making them. The fish that lives in the dark rivers of Mammoth Cave has never seen anything. Its lineage has not seen anything for something like 20,000 years. It navigates by pressure waves and by chemistry and by memory encoded in its nervous system. It is perfectly adapted to a world that most other creatures cannot survive in. There is something deeply moving about these animals. They represent a kind of fierce, committed adaptation, a willingness, in evolutionary terms, to become something very different from your origins in order to persist. To give up capacities that define you in exchange for the ability to continue existing in a place that doesn't allow those capacities to be useful. Roger Brucker found them moving too. He wrote about the cave fish with a kind of reverence, as creatures that had solved the cave's central challenge in the most radical way possible. Instead of bringing light into the darkness, they had learned to live without it. The second major expansion of the known extent of Mammoth Cave happened in 1979, when explorers found a connection to a cave system called the Proctor Cave and several other systems to the south, extending the total mapped length significantly. And it kept growing. The 1980s and 1990s and 2000s brought expedition after expedition, survey after survey, each one adding miles to the mapped extent of the system. Every few years, a new record. Every few years, the announcement that the longest cave in the world had gotten longer. Because here is the thing, the cave keeps going. Every time the cavers find what they think is the end of a passage, they find a crack or a draft or a tight squeeze that opens into something they've never seen. The cave resists being finished. It resists being completely known. Roger Brucker was involved in this ongoing effort well into his later years. He was not the youngest or most physically capable explorer in the Cave Research Foundation as he aged, but he was one of the most experienced, and experience matters enormously underground. He knew the cave. He knew how to read its passages, how to follow the geology, how to interpret the movements of air and water. He trained younger explorers and led expeditions, and continued adding to the map. But increasingly, in the accounts of his later explorations, he talked less about the technical details and more about the experience, about what the cave felt like, about the quality of the dark in certain rooms, about the particular silence of places that had never been disturbed by human sound. He talked about time. In the cave, he said, time is not the same. Not in the subjective sense, not just the familiar fact that time seems to pass differently when you are engaged in demanding work in a strange environment. He meant something more fundamental. He said that in the cave, particularly in the deep sections, far from any entrance, you felt the presence of geological time, the millions of years of the cave's formation pressing against the present moment. The human scale of time, years, generations, centuries, felt thin and fragile against the backdrop of what the cave expressed. He said standing in a room that had been forming for 300 million years changed the way you thought about everything. It made your problems smaller. It made your life larger. It put you in proper perspective, not in a crushing, nihilistic way, not in the way of being made to feel insignificant, in the way of being made to feel part of something enormous and ongoing and worthy of reverence. He said this often, and the people who heard him say it understood that he was not speaking metaphorically. He meant it literally. He had felt this physically in his body, in the deep rooms of Mammoth Cave. The lit rooms. Let me tell you about the survey process in more detail, because it is central to what makes the mapping work so remarkable. When a CRF survey team reaches the edge of the known cave, the furthest point of the existing map, and pushes into new territory, They do not simply go forward and come back and say, there are passages over there. They measure. Every passage is measured in 3 dimensions. The surveyor in front calls back distances and angles. The note-taker in the rear writes them down. At each survey station, the sketcher notes the width and height of the passage, the shape of the walls and ceiling, the nature of the floor, the presence of formations or geological features. A careful sketch is made that can later be drafted into a precise map. This work is done in the dark, in cold, often in uncomfortable positions, sometimes underwater, sometimes in passages so tight that the surveyor cannot turn around to communicate with the note-taker and must call back over their shoulder. It is done with small instruments that must be held steady in hands that may be shaking from cold or from the effort of getting to that point. It is done by people who are often tired, often wet, often physically stressed from hours of demanding movement through difficult terrain. And the maps that result from this work are extraordinary. The Mammoth Cave system map, built up over decades of this kind of work by hundreds of dedicated volunteers, is one of the most complex and detailed maps of any geographical feature on Earth. It shows passages in 3 dimensions, with their depths below the surface, their intersections with other passages, their connections to surface features like valleys and rivers, their geological context. It is a document of enormous scientific value, not just for understanding Mammoth Cave, but for understanding how cave systems form, how water moves through karst landscapes, how underground ecosystems work. The map is also a record of human effort that is staggering in its accumulation. Each of those 400+ miles of passage represents a team of people reaching that passage, sometimes after hours of effort just to get there, surveying it, and emerging with data. The total number of person-hours represented by the Mammoth Cave map is probably in the hundreds of thousands, maybe more. Roger Brucker contributed to that map for more than 50 years. His individual contribution, the passages he surveyed, the expeditions he led, the training he provided to other surveyors, represents a significant fraction of the total effort. Without the work he and his colleagues did in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the connection between Flint Ridge and Mammoth Cave might not have been found when it was, might have taken much longer. Might have waited for different people with different technology. But it didn't have to wait, because Roger Brucker and his colleagues went down there with their compasses and their notebooks and their headlamps, and they stayed down there and they measured and they mapped, year after year, expedition after expedition, and the map grew. Now, I want to talk about what happened underground in the late hours of certain expeditions. The deep cave has an effect on people. It is documented, discussed among serious cavers, and not fully explained by science. It is not a hallucination and it is not a fantasy. It is something that happens to real people in the real world under specific conditions, and it is reported with enough consistency and enough detail that it demands to be taken seriously. The effect happens most strongly on extended expeditions, when a team has been underground for many hours, sometimes more than 24 hours straight, when fatigue is setting in and the body is cold and the sensory environment has been stripped to its absolute minimum, when there is nothing, truly nothing, to perceive except the small circle of lamplight and the cave. In this state, certain cavers report a shift in perception. The boundaries of the self seem to become less fixed. The sense of being separate from the cave, of being a visitor in it, a foreign element in an alien environment, weakens. A feeling develops that the cave is not an obstacle or a space to move through, but something more continuous with your own experience. Some cavers describe this as frightening, some find it peaceful, some find it so disorienting that they signal to the team that they need to rest, or to head back, because their judgment is becoming unreliable. And some, a small number, the ones who have most deeply committed themselves to the underground world, find it illuminating. Roger Brucker was one of the ones who found it illuminating. He talked about it carefully always. He was not the kind of man to make dramatic claims. He did not say he had supernatural experiences. He did not say the cave had a spirit or a consciousness in any mystical sense. What he said, what he kept saying in different ways in different conversations, was that in the deep cave, in the right state, he perceived things that he could not normally perceive. That the quality of the darkness was not uniform, that certain spaces had a different character, not frighteningly different, but differently resonant, that the dark in certain rooms had a warmth to it, a luminosity that was not exactly visible but was somehow present. He chose his words carefully when he talked about this. He knew how it sounded. He was talking to scientists and journalists and skeptics. He knew that the cave was lit was not a statement that could be made without inviting questions about his mental state, about the effects of fatigue and cold, and prolonged darkness on perception. He made it anyway. He made it because it was true, in his experience, and because he believed that accurate reporting of what he had actually experienced mattered more than protecting himself from skepticism. In 2006, Roger Brucker co-authored a book called Trapped, The Story of Floyd Collins. It is, among other things, a meditation on what it means to be underground, on the relationship between human beings and the world beneath their feet, on the courage required to enter a space that could kill you, and the specific quality of attention that the cave demands from anyone who takes it seriously. The book is dedicated to the cavers of the Cave Research Foundation, to the men and women who went underground year after year and gave their weekends and their physical comfort and their safety to the project of understanding what was down there. But reading it, you sense something more personal. You sense that Brucker is also working out his own relationship to the cave. The book about Floyd Collins, about the man who went in and couldn't come back out, is written by a man who went in hundreds of times and always came back out. There is a confrontation happening in the pages between those two fates, between the unlucky and the fortunate, between the cave that killed and the cave that gave. Because the cave did give. This is what Brucker's life says, whatever else it says. The cave gave him an identity, it gave him a community, it gave him the project of his life, the enormous, ongoing, never-finished project of understanding this one place. It gave him the satisfaction of discovery, real discovery, the first human eyes in rooms that had been dark since before humans existed. It gave him the strange, difficult-to-articulate reward of extended time underground, the recalibration of senses, the presence of deep time. And it gave him the lit rooms. Whatever those were, whatever explanation accounts for them, whether optical, neurological, geological, or something that sits outside our current categories, they were a gift. They were the cave's way of giving back to a man who had given it so much of his life. Mammoth Cave became a national park in 1941 and a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1981. The recognition came with resources and protections that the cave needed. The delicate underground ecosystem is fragile, and the human traffic of tourism puts pressure on it in ways that require careful management. The cave's formations can be irreparably damaged by touch. The microorganisms that live in the cave are sensitive to contamination from the surface world. But the national park designation also came with something that the serious explorers of the Cave Research Foundation had complicated feelings about. Bureaucracy. Managing a national park requires rules and schedules and permits and paperwork. It requires coordination between independent explorers and federal agencies. It requires the negotiation of access to passages that might be scientifically important, but also physically demanding and potentially dangerous for casual visitors. The Cave Research Foundation navigated this relationship with the National Park Service over the decades with what seems, from the outside, like remarkable success. The CRF became the scientific partner of the park, the organization that conducted the serious exploratory and survey work, while the park managed the tourist infrastructure and the protection protocols. This partnership has produced more mapped cave than any comparable effort anywhere in the world. It has been, in its way, a model of how scientific exploration and conservation can work together rather than against each other. Roger Brucker was one of the people who helped make that partnership work. His skills as a communicator, his ability to explain what the work was, why it mattered, what was at stake in the cave, helped create the case for the serious exploratory work that the CRF was doing. He was not just a mapper. He was an advocate. He made people care about the cave who had never been underground. Let me tell you about the sound of Mammoth Cave. In the tourist sections, near the entrance, there are sounds: water dripping, the creak and shuffle of the people around you, the guide's voice, the faint whisper of the cave's breath. But go deeper, go far enough that the sounds of tourism fade behind you. Go to one of the rooms far from any entrance, in a section where no water is currently flowing, where the geological processes of active cave formation are, for the moment, quiet. The silence in those rooms is unlike any silence you have ever heard. Because silence at the surface is never complete. The ambient noise of the natural world, wind, insects, distant traffic, the movement of animals is always present. Even in the most isolated place on the surface of the earth, there is sound. The world hums at a frequency that you stop consciously hearing, but that your ears are always processing. In the deep cave there is nothing: no wind, no insects, no animals in this part of the system, no mechanical noise from the surface, no sound at all except what you make yourself. And your sounds, your breathing, your footsteps, the creak of your pack straps, the rustle of your clothing in that absolute silence are startling. You are aware of yourself in a way that the surface world, with its constant auditory background, never forces you to be. You can hear your own heartbeat. You can hear the movement of air in your lungs. For people who experience anxiety, this can be overwhelming. For people who are comfortable with themselves, it can be deeply peaceful. Roger Brucker, by all accounts, was comfortable with himself. He was a man who found the silence of the deep cave not frightening but clarifying. He talked about the cave's silence the way some people talk about meditation, as a condition that allowed him to hear things that the noise of the surface world drowned out. Not mystical things, practical things, the sound of his own physical state, the sound of the passage ahead, because passages do have sounds, subtle ones, the particular echo of a large space versus a small one, the faint trickling of water in a distant channel, the barely perceptible sound of moving air. These sounds in the cave's silence became navigational instruments. An experienced caver in the deep cave learns to read the cave with his ears as well as his eyes. The sound of a passage tells you something about where it goes. The presence or absence of air movement, which in the cave's silence you can sometimes hear rather than just feel, tells you whether passage is connected to the larger system or is a dead end. Roger Brucker had ears that had been trained by years underground. He heard things in the cave that first-time visitors could not hear. There is a room in Mammoth Cave called Mammoth Dome. It is a vertical shaft, not a room in the conventional sense, but a circular column of empty space more than 190 feet high. Looking up from the floor of Mammoth Dome, your headlamp cannot illuminate the ceiling. The shaft rises above you into darkness that your light cannot penetrate, as if the cave continues upward forever. From above, from the surface, if you knew exactly where to stand in the Kentucky woods, you would be standing on a thin crust of rock over an invisible vertical drop of nearly 200 feet. Mammoth Dome was discovered in the 1800s and has been visited by tourists since then. It is one of the features that made the cave famous in the early tourist era. Visitors by lantern light, before electric lamps were installed, would throw burning paper into the dome and watch the fragments of fire drift up into the black space above them, illuminating the dome's walls briefly as they rose. Those first visitors were trying to see the top of the dome with the technology they had. They were trying to understand the scale of the space they were in by sending light upward into it. The light never reached the top, not back then. When Roger Brucker stood in Mammoth Dome, which he must have done many times because it was near the cave's main corridors and unavoidable for anyone doing deep exploration, he knew what was above him. He had the survey data. He knew the dome was 190 feet tall, that the walls were carved limestone bearing the marks of millions of years of water flow, that the thin rock crust above was covered by Kentucky forest. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it physically are different. Even for a man who had spent 50 years underground, standing at the base of Mammoth Dome with the darkness rising above you and your headlamp unable to show you where it ends, that was always, Roger Brucker said, a moment that restored his sense of wonder. He never got used to it. He said the cave never let him get used to it. Every time he thought he had fully incorporated the scale of Mammoth Cave into his understanding, the cave would show him another room, another dome, another passage going somewhere extraordinary, and his sense of wonder would be reset to zero. He said this like it was a gift. In the years after the Flint Ridge connection was made, as the surveyed extent of the system continued to grow, the question that haunted cave scientists became more insistent. Where does it end? Geologically, the cave system has boundaries. The limestone formation that the cave is carved through does not extend forever. At its edges, it is bounded by other rock types, shale, sandstone, that do not dissolve the way limestone does. Theoretically, there is an extent to the possible cave, a geological boundary beyond which no cave passage can exist. But within those theoretical geological boundaries, the cave has consistently exceeded every estimate of its size. Every time cavers have reached what appeared to be the limit of the system, a passage that ended at a solid wall, a section where the limestone was too thin or too broken for passages to form, they have, often years later, found a way around it. A crack, a passage at a different level, a connection through a section that seemed impenetrable. The cave resists being finished. Roger Brucker was aware of this. He talked about it as one of the cave's most remarkable qualities. Most large geographical features have known extents. You can walk around a mountain. You can measure a river from source to sea. But Mammoth Cave kept growing every time you looked at it. It was a moving target, a map that was never finished. He said this was one of the things that kept bringing him back, the knowledge that there was always more, that the cave was inexhaustible, not literally, not in any absolute geological sense, but practically in the scale of a human lifetime or even many human lifetimes. You could not run out of Mammoth Cave, you could not come to its end. And in certain moods, he said, this felt like the cave's deepest teaching, that there are things in this world that you cannot exhaust, that resist being fully known, that always have something more to give. The cave was one of those things. I want to tell you about the formations. Because so far we have talked about passages and rooms and the act of exploration. But inside those passages and rooms, the cave has created some of the most extraordinary mineral formations on Earth. Stalactites are the ones everyone knows, the stone icicles that hang from cave ceilings, built up over thousands of years as mineral-rich water drips from cracks above. Each stalactite grows downward, millimeter by millimeter, as each drip deposits a tiny fraction of its dissolved mineral content before falling. In active cave sections, if you are very patient and very quiet, you can sometimes watch water drip from the tip of a stalactite. Each drop adds an atom's worth of stone to the formation and falls to the floor below, where it builds the upward-growing companion formation, the stalagmite. When a stalactite and a stalagmite meet, they form a column. Some of the columns in Mammoth Cave have been growing for more than 1 million years. Gypsum flowers are another formation, delicate crystalline structures that grow outward from cave walls in curling, spiral shapes, sometimes several feet long. They grow in conditions of low humidity and no liquid water, deposited instead directly from vapor. They are fragile almost beyond belief. A single touch can break formations that took thousands of years to grow. Cave pearls form where water drips into small depressions, slowly depositing mineral layers around a central grain of material, building up over time into rounded concentric spheres. They look exactly like natural pearls, except made of calcite instead of nacre. Helictites are the strangest formations, curved or branching crystal structures that seem to defy gravity, growing in unexpected directions with no apparent relationship to the pull toward the ground. The physics of their formation is not completely understood. They appear to be influenced by tiny variations in air pressure and mineral saturation in ways that create growth patterns too complex to predict. The result is formations that look as though someone carved them, too strange, too sculptural, too deliberately artistic to be the product of random chemistry. But they are the product of random chemistry, that's the thing. All of these formations, the stalactites and stalagmites and columns and gypsum flowers and cave pearls and helictites, are the product of water and minerals and time and nothing else. No intention, no design, just chemistry happening in the dark. And the result is this, a world of forms unlike anything on the surface. A world of shapes and textures and structures that look as though they were made by an artist working in complete isolation, following no rules but the rules of chemistry for millions of years. Roger Brucker moved through this world with a reverence that never diminished. He wrote about cave formations the way someone writes about great art, with careful attention to what exactly they were looking at and why it mattered. He documented them in the survey records with precision and described them in his writing with poetry. He said that one of the things the cave gave him was an education in beauty. Not the easy, obvious beauty of sunsets and flowers, the beauty that human aesthetic systems are designed to recognize because it correlates with health and abundance and good conditions for survival. The deep beauty of the cave was stranger than that. It was the beauty of things formed without any intention of being beautiful, things that became beautiful as a byproduct of pure physical processes operating over timescales that dwarf human experience. He found this kind of beauty more profound than the surface kind, not prettier, not more appealing, more profound, more true. Let's come back to Roger Brucker in his last years of active exploration. By the first decade of the 2000s, he was in his 70s. He was still going underground, not through the most demanding physical passages. The years had taken a toll, as they take a toll on everyone, but into the cave, into the accessible sections of the deep system, to run surveys, to mentor younger explorers, to simply be in the place that had been the center of his life for 5 decades. He had written multiple books. He had given hundreds of lectures. He had been recognized with awards and honors from the scientific and conservation communities. His contribution to the understanding of Mammoth Cave was, by any measure, extraordinary. But he kept going underground. Not out of obligation, not for the recognition. He kept going underground because the cave was where something essential to him existed, something he could not find on the surface, something that he had been trying to describe for 50 years and never quite managed to fully articulate. The light. In the interviews from this period, he talked more openly about the experience that he had carefully and quietly mentioned throughout his career. The rooms in the deep cave that were not entirely dark, the quality of light that he had noticed in certain spaces, the sense that in certain chambers, removed from any source of natural or artificial illumination, there was a quality of presence that manifested as something close to light. He was specific about the conditions under which this occurred. It was always in the deep cave, far from any entrance. It was always after extended time underground, not on the first hours of a trip, but later, when the body had settled into the cave's reality and the surface world had become distant. It was always in the largest rooms, the highest ceilinged chambers where the cave's scale was most dramatically apparent. And it was always, this is significant, consistent with what other cavers had reported independently. Not the same cavers, reporting to each other and comparing notes. Different cavers in different eras in different contexts, describing the same phenomenon in their own words. The cave's old rooms, the rooms that felt lit. He had a hypothesis about it. He did not state it as fact, he was too careful for that, but he offered it as a possible explanation, or as a pointer toward an explanation, that might someday be worth investigating properly. He thought the cave had accumulated light. Not in any conventional physical sense, not in the sense of stored photons or fluorescent minerals or bioluminescence, but in the sense that certain spaces that had been visited for thousands of years, that had been important to the people who went underground, that had been the sites of extraordinary human experiences over very long periods of time, had taken on some quality that was connected to that history. He was reaching here, he knew he was reaching, but he offered it anyway because he was honest and because it was what the experience suggested to him. The rooms that were still lit, he said, were the rooms where something had happened, where people had been and had brought their light and their wonder and their fear and their reverence, where human experience had accumulated in the stone the way minerals accumulated into formations. Where the cave remembered being seen. In 2019, Roger Brucker passed away. He was 87 years old. He had spent more than 5 decades actively exploring Mammoth Cave. He had contributed to surveys that added hundreds of miles to the world's understanding of the system. He had written books that brought the experience of the deep cave to readers who would never go underground. He had trained generations of cavers and scientists. He had been present for one of the great geographical discoveries of the 20th century, the connection of the Flint Ridge system to Mammoth Cave, and had been a central figure in the work that made that discovery possible. He left behind a body of work, maps, surveys, books, articles, interviews, that constitutes one of the most detailed and personal records of a place that exists in American writing. Reading it, you have the sense of someone who had found the place that mattered to him and had returned to it over and over for 50 years, going deeper each time, finding more each time, and at the end, having the honesty to report not just what his instruments told him, but what his experience told him. Including the lights. The cave is still going. Right now tonight, as you read this, Mammoth Cave is extending itself. Water is moving through passages too small for any person to follow, dissolving limestone atom by atom, widening cracks that in 10,000 years will become passages large enough to explore. Formations are growing, drip by drip, in rooms that no one has ever entered. Air is moving through the system, carrying the smell of deep limestone and old dark and the cave's particular exhalation. The animals of the cave are going about their extraordinary adapted lives. The blind cave fish are navigating the dark rivers with their pressure-sensitive lateral lines, catching whatever food washes through the underground channels. The cave crickets are hunting in the darkness. The white crayfish are moving along the bottom of underground pools. And somewhere in the 400-plus miles of mapped passages, and in the unknown miles beyond the map's edge, there are rooms that no human being has ever seen. Rooms that have been dark since before there were human beings. Rooms that have been waiting in the patience of geological time for a headlamp to first illuminate their walls. The Cave Research Foundation is still active, still sending teams underground, still adding to the map, still pushing the edge of the known cave further into the unknown. The work Roger Brucker gave his life to continues. And the rooms are still lit. I want to end by talking about what this story means. Not in a grand, sweeping sense, not in the sense of what it means for human civilization or for the history of exploration, but in the smaller, more personal sense of what it means for anyone who finds themselves standing at the edge of something large and dark and unknown. Roger Brucker was not a famous man in the way that explorers of previous centuries were famous. He was not Lewis and Clark. He was not Magellan. He did not plant a flag on a newly discovered continent or sail to a pole. He crawled through mud in Kentucky for 50 years and drew maps of what he found. But what he found was this, that the world is inexhaustible, that in a time when everything seems to have been mapped, measured, photographed, and catalogued, there are still places where a person can go and see something for the first time. There are still discoveries to be made. There are still rooms that have never had a light shone into them. And in those rooms he found something else, something that geology cannot fully account for, and that science has not yet fully explained. A quality of the dark that suggested the dark was not empty. A quality of old, deep places that suggested that something accumulates in them, call it what you will, over the long passage of time. He spent his whole life going into the dark and coming back with light. Not just the light of knowledge, the maps, the surveys, the scientific data, but the stranger light, the light of the lit rooms, the light that was there before him and would be there after him. He was the last man who mapped the caves under Kentucky in the way that matters, not as a professional obligation, not as a career project, but as a calling, as the central project of a life, pursued with the full force of a person's intelligence and energy and love. And when he came out for the last time, he spoke of rooms that were still lit. He was right. The rooms are still there, the lights are still on. You just have to know where to look. The next time you are in Kentucky, or anywhere near the land of limestone and karst, the land of secret water and underground rooms, find a quiet place and put your hand near the ground, near a crack in the rock, near a hole in a hillside where cold air breathes against your palm. That breath you feel, that is the cave, still there, still breathing, still keeping its rooms in the dark and the silence, the same rooms it has kept for millions of years, the same rooms where people with torches went long before history was written, the same rooms where a man with a headlamp spent 50 years mapping the world that nobody else could see. And in some of those rooms, if you go deep enough and stay long enough and let the surface world fall far enough away, the dark is different. Not quite dark. Not quite lit. Something in between, something the cave has been building for a very long time. Roger Brucker called them the lit rooms. And wherever he is now, I think he knows what lit them. End.